Hello, everyone. This is Rick Chatelain from the Blood Center in New Orleans, and welcome to the CEO Choice. I would like to remind everybody for your CEU credits to refer to page 5 of your toolkit, and the code will be given in the chat area a little bit later on. Also, for those of you on the mobile app, we are understanding there's not an easy way to pose questions via the chat feature. So you can use the messages feature, compose and send me a message directly, and I'll be glad to forward those questions on to David and Nancy. So today we are going to hear from David Green, President and CEO of Vitalant, and Nancy Eckert, President and CEO at, I'm sorry. I'll get the bio on Nancy later. I'm sorry. But anyway, first I'd like to introduce David Green. Dave currently serves as President and CEO of Vitalant. In addition to the Vitalant Blood Services Division, Dave has oversight responsibility for BioCare, a for-profit subsidiary providing specialty pharma distribution services. Canyon Care RX, a full-service pharmacy specializing in medications for bleeding disorders. The Vitalant Research Institute, with locations in San Francisco, Denver, and Pittsburgh, and Vitalant's wholly owned subsidiary, Canyon State Insurance. Vitalant is also a partner in the operation of Creative Testing Solutions. Dave is active in the industry, leadership roles, and is past chair of Blood Centers of America, past president of America's Blood Centers, and is president-elect of ABB on the current board, and the board chair for the Alliance of Blood Operators. So without further ado, I'd like to present Mr. David Green.
Well, welcome. My name is David Green, and I am the President and CEO of Vitalant. For those who don't know about our history in terms of the name change, we used to be known by a variety of different names, including Blood Systems, United Blood Services, Bonte's Blood Program, LifeShare, LifeStream. Well, regardless, we decided we needed one name, and we ended up with Vitalant. I am very appreciative of the opportunity to spend some time with you today to talk about our experiences with COVID. Now, when I was asked by Dr. Bryant to consider doing this presentation, she indicated it could be on anything I wanted to talk about. And so I spent some time deliberating over that, but ultimately, I think all of us have been, at least for the past 4 or 5 months, pretty much doing nothing but dealing with COVID. For us, it's been particularly impactful, and I believe, frankly, for the entire country and across the globe, we're seeing such significant change and impacts from this that I decided ultimately this is what I wanted to spend my time with you talking about. So first off, I want to clarify what I'm going to talk about today really constitutes my opinions on things. I don't want to have anyone believe that those are opinions endorsed by my employer, Vitalant, or certainly not anything that ABB or any of the other associations that I'm involved in would endorse particularly. They may agree, they may not. I thought it important, though, particularly when I was thinking through what am I going to talk about today, that we give you an opportunity to really see kind of inside Vitalant, to understand what the depth of challenges we've been dealing with, and hopefully those will help you understand some ideas on how to take a look at your own experiences and move forward. So I'll cover what happened and how we responded, and I'll talk briefly about some of the operational impacts as well as the organizational response or approach to the situation. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about lessons learned, because I think that when you face any challenge like this, that ultimately, after you deliver on your mission, is the most important thing, because like it or not, we're going to see something like this again, and most certainly even though in many respects I'll talk about COVID as something that's done, it's not done. I don't even know what inning we're in this series, and ultimately it could go on for quite some time. I want to spend some time talking about environmental shifts, and what do I mean by that? What I'm talking about is our external forces that are impacting how we do what we do. I believe that because this is such a prolonged experience, many of the things that we're wrestling with now are developing patterns, and those patterns will stick. So I want to spend some time on that. And then finally, figure out what I think are some disruptive opportunities, but also some threats that we need to pay attention to. And then leave you with some closing thoughts. So very much appreciate your time today. So we all saw pretty much the same thing in terms of how COVID evolved, but a couple of key takeaways, I believe, from looking at this rather detailed list. First of all, this evolved quickly. I will tell you that when we first saw this hit in China, I was looking at it more as a spectator, not expecting it was going to come and affect the U.S. at some point, but clearly it did. And then once it hit Washington State, I thought, okay, this thing will be managed in a way such that it's not going to expand to the degree it has. It wasn't long after that it became quite clear that this, in fact, was going to be a major challenge for everyone. And it's moved quickly to the point where in a matter of 3 months from the time first identified in China, we were at 80% of Americans in some sort of lockdown phase, whether it be a shelter-in-place order or other restrictions that were being imposed to try and get control of the spread of this virus. But that was just the early story. And so as all this is developing, what were we seeing, at least from a blood operator standpoint? Well, the very first thing that we really saw was as businesses were starting to shut down or close doors temporarily, and certainly a rapid move toward a work from home posture by many of those organizations, not surprisingly, we saw a lot of our blood drives being canceled. And so this chart shows, and I'll call your attention to the purple line here, along about early March, we started to see a whole lot of blood drives being canceled. Not surprising. Now, the yellow or gold line represents what we historically would tend to see in terms of cancellations for a variety of reasons. But this significant uptick that started in early March and really sustained through the end of April was significant in terms of impact on our operation, and I believe most blood centers across the country. But the reality is, when you take a look at just those 2 months, and this is just for Vitalant, we lost nearly 4,800 blood drives that would have represented 128,000 red cell units that we would process and make available for patient care. So clearly a significant impact, and to use the overused phrase or term, unprecedented. It was certainly something in my 30 years in blood banking I had never seen. And that's why when I tried to figure out what to call this talk, I thought confused is probably a major characteristic of where I am right now, because I've never seen this before. I, like many people, are doing the best we can with limited information, but ultimately I'm making mistakes. I would assume most people are as we try and navigate this fluid environment. Now, surprisingly, with all of those blood drives having been canceled, our collections in March went up much higher than we ever anticipated. So one would think, okay, you lose your blood drives, your collections are going to go down. Well, not the case. Ours actually went up. Why? Well, because of the outpouring of support and the call to action led in large part by the FDA, as well as the Surgeon General and others on a national media stage saying, get out and donate blood. Those people were coming to our fixed sites, which for us, it was previously not our primary place to draw. But as you take a look at what we saw in the way of our projection accuracy at the fixed sites, again, if you take a look, this is our typical run rate, about 95%. But starting along the middle of March, we saw a huge upswing in terms of show rates at our fixed sites. Now, it did drop off after March, back down to somewhat closer to normal, but even to this day, our fixed sites are doing much stronger than our mobile operations. But at the same time, while the collections were going up, we saw a significant drop in blood demand. Now, again, in retrospect, this wasn't surprising, but we weren't anticipating how rapidly elective procedures would be canceled or indefinitely deferred. So we saw, again, along about April timeframe, April 11th, was our low point in terms of about a 30% drop in our red cell demand based upon historical levels. We also saw a drop in platelets and plasma as well. So while we had this upswing in draw, we had a downward movement in demand. And not surprisingly, that combined to produce one of the strongest blood inventories I've seen in my 30 years. Something on the order of close to 10% O negative, 10 days on hand of O negative, in my experience, is totally unexpected and unprecedented. Typically, we would see somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 days. So this was a new reality for us, and it posed some additional challenges. How do you manage such a robust inventory? Because as we all know, working closely with our hospital partners, none of us want to waste any of this product. So we had to move quickly and respond to this new reality that we were facing. But it wasn't just us. If you take a look at this ABC report that was shared with me, it shows whole blood inventories, and it is across all independent blood centers. And you can see pretty much, and this again is along mid-March timeframe, a huge increase in terms of blood supply. So this was not isolated in one part of the country, or certainly not one blood center, but rather this was a national phenomenon that we were all seeing. So as you take a look, though, and this represents the O positive U.S. daily supply from March through June, and it compares this orange line here is 2019, and the blue line represents 2020. So this is the increase that I just talked about, but as you see it start to decline, it actually passes the point along about middle of May, comes back up again, but then drops down. So headed into June in 2020, after having one of the strongest blood supplies I'd ever seen, we actually were in a dire condition in terms of shortage. What happened? Well, all of the national focus on get out and donate blood had pretty much been replaced by other areas of focus. Without that national championing of the donation message, we actually saw a rapid decline as those blood products were utilized. They weren't being replaced because, again, we didn't have that robust mobile operation. So as all of this is going on, at Vitalant, we decided we needed some sort of rational approach to figure out how to manage all of these different details. Because while we're trying to run our daily operation, we've got all sorts of external stimuli coming in from different points. And we had to respond to all of that and deal with the constant fluid nature of this experience. So what we did was we came up with this particular model. So you'll see in the center here, it focuses on, what are the COVID issues facing us as an organization. We then organized all of those issues into 5 distinct buckets. Those things that were related to government restrictions. So, for example, travel restrictions. Well, you can't travel here. If you travel here, you have to be quarantined when you return. We also had national, state, and local shelter orders. Governors would come out with a proclamation indicating, you couldn't be out and about unless you were essential service, which we were, but ultimately it represented other types of challenges. For example, we had staff that were traveling on the road that would get pulled over, and they were delivering blood, and so we very quickly learned we needed to ensure all our staff had information with them to clear them so they could get through some of the roadblocks that were set up in certain states. Certainly, CDC, OSHA guidance, those were evolving and requirements being laid out, and particularly in masks. What we thought was going to be our long-term stance on masks ended up being 180 reversal for where we actually ended up not too long afterward. We also had to put together what we call an implementation of rapid response team, and this was related to protecting the workforce. As we saw people, our staff, get exposed to COVID, it obviously represents major challenges because figuring out how long they had contact with others and what the impact was like. I'll give you an example. We had a component lab at one of our locations that within a month essentially had no staff left because they were all in quarantine related to COVID exposure. So we put together this team to evaluate, and it included physicians, folks from quality, the medical oversight group, as well as legal and our operations team, to try and evaluate all of these cases that were coming in. And that included some of our donor contact issues that we ran into later on. So protecting the workforce, absolutely key. And, we had an implementation of work from home strategy. Now, many people did, and I will tell you at this point, we are predominantly, for our non-operations people, still in a work from home profile. Communications with employees we found to be an absolute challenge, primarily because there was so much information coming in. And early on, we thought, we got to get this out to our employees. But the reality was, we were firing updates out to employees at a frequency they couldn't process the information. And so I'll talk a little bit later about how we organize that differently. But understanding, obviously, during times of crisis, communications are key. And then PPE, what a major challenge that was. We didn't have a standard practice of our donor care staff wearing masks, interacting with donors. We do now. And so that represented a lot of changes we had to put into place, but we quickly realized gaining access to masks wasn't all that easy. That represented all different types of challenges. We had to figure out, okay, what are our critical supplies? Well, we had that from the disaster plans that we had done, but engaging with those suppliers in sometimes formal written manner to ensure that we had a sustainable supply of those key resources so that we could continue to do our mission. So supply chain stabilization was absolutely critical and required a lot of focus and activity. Then in terms of business and financial impact, a significant drop in product usage, well, that has a direct impact obviously on our revenues and ultimately our bottom line, and led to some severe financial impacts that we had to work our way through. We also had to evaluate all these new legislative measures that were coming out. The CARES Act, how do we deal with that? How do we process that to take care of our employees? We had to figure out how do we preserve the donor base. FDA came out with some very welcome changes in deferrals, but how do we get that put into place? How do we manage reinstatement of previously deferred donors? A lot of challenge associated with that. And then, in terms of life-saving treatments, we had provision of CCP to hospital customers. We obviously, like like other blood centers, had never dealt with CCP. So this was a completely new venture for us and required a lot of coordination and communication. There was a PrEP Act immunity that we had sensitivity to, because as we're dealing with this crisis, we're trying to figure out what are the legal protections we're going to have as an organization, so that in trying to do well, trying to do the right thing, we're not going to jeopardize the long-term viability of the organization through liability exposure. So it was a significant area of focus for us as well. And then certainly the ramp up of convalescent plasma, which is currently a major priority for us, as well as many other programs across the country. We also, at our research institute, Mike Bush and his team came up with some very progressive thoughts around how to leverage the research team to benefit the community in a broad way, and I would say across the country, but doing so in partnership with other blood providers and hospitals, so that really we're benefiting the science as we try and improve our ability to manage this situation. So in order to manage all of this, I decided early on we needed a chief of staff, and somebody had to be kind of the go-to person. All this information really had to pass through that one individual. I decided to ask Dirk Johnson. Some of you may know Dirk from previous encounters, a great guy, but he really demonstrated a sense of brilliance in the ability to manage all these multifaceted issues and the multiple streams of communication and inquiries that were coming in at rapid rate. So he really excelled in this, and our sincere appreciation for his role in that regard. We also developed a leadership COVID-19 task force that included our corporate office as well as our field-based directors. We had to accelerate how we were looking at our production because of the massive fluctuations we were seeing in demand, as well as our ability to produce. We had to put together a convalescent plasma process and communications worker. Again, totally new venture for us, pulling people together, figuring out how to do it, how to interpret what was coming from the regulators as to how to do this properly, and getting feedback from our hospitals who were communicating to us. These are, the anecdotal results that we're seeing from this, and processing that so that we can make better decisions about how rapidly to scale that production. And then, of course, the execution of the CCP through the convalescent plasma team. And then on a daily basis, we were huddling together as an executive team, trying to figure out, where were we at? How did we feel about the employee base at this point? What were we seeing in terms of shifts or trends? Communication throughout this process was absolutely key, because it was a changing landscape. During the time frame, this was from January 29th until long about mid-April, we saw 27 different directives come out from different organizations, whether it be CDC or the FDA or any of the other regulators. We had to respond to those. We had to change donor entry signs related to travel restrictions. We had to adjust site safety related to PPE changes, and request some variances so we could continue to operate in this environment, and adjusted certain lab and safety testing practices. And of course, convalescent plasma in its own regard took considerable focus, because our understanding of what we needed to do there constantly changes, and it still does. So it was a constant change of trying to figure out, how do we modify our collection plans? How do we deal with blood drive cancellations? Updating HR policies, dealing with IT exposure issues, supply chain challenges. In the end, it was a massive undertaking. So given all of that load that we had to carry, we realized very quickly we had to pretty much suspend what we had been working on. We had a lot of projects planned for this year. In fact, ironically, our business plan for this year was entitled a year of stability and reinvestment. Well, that didn't last very long. Stable? Absolutely not. It's more the year of upheaval and unprecedented experience. So we suspended most projects that we had in place. Some we had to keep going. We also made available to all staff the ability to go into negative balance on PTO just because we recognized many of them were challenged by childcare situations and other realities, and so they could go up to 80 hours in the hole on PTO. We did adopt a very liberal work from home policy. Cybersecurity was something I was a little surprised by. The number of hacking attempts that we started to see very quickly into this crisis spiked tremendously. So we had a lot of rapid work that we had to do to adjust some of the cybersecurity. We had lots of communications going out related to masks, the changes there. We were doing expense reductions, and ultimately decided pretty quickly we couldn't issue communications as they came in. We needed to package them, and I'm sure many of you had already figured that out, but ultimately the packaging into a recognizable framework that staff could make sense out of, we found to be quite helpful as well. We had to ensure our banks were understanding of our circumstances, what we were doing about it, and the CFO did a marvelous job in that regard. Reviewing all the new legislation, we ensured that we kept our board informed, going to weekly updates as opposed to the typical monthly that I do. And then we had assets that we weren't using. If we're not running mobiles to the degree we were before, we had a lot of idle buses. We have 130 self-contained blood mobiles. Most of them weren't being used. So we did outreach to some other organizations and ultimately had a very constructive outcome with an infusion company in order to have a mobile infusion capability for them. But sadly, we also had to do furloughs. SMT took pay cuts in support of our employee base in our efforts to try and match our expense profile with our new revenue reality. So throughout all of this, our primary focus, after the mission, delivering blood to patients, we had to ensure our staff were safe. So we really adopted a variety of initiatives, and I think most of you have probably done many of these as well, if not all of them, and perhaps even more. I think the bottom line message, though, here is the requirements changed a lot. What we thought initially was, well, masks aren't important. And of course, the CDC came out and really reversed that. And they said, well, everybody ought to be wearing masks, which is our new reality. So the change here was dramatic. Throughout all this time, Mike Bush and his team were focused on trying to advance the science in terms of understanding of COVID and be an ally and resource in partnership with other blood programs to conduct meaningful research so that we could gain a better understanding of what COVID was all about, the impact in terms of seroprevalence monitoring, observing trends, and trying to understand how the disease was progressing and mitigation steps we might be able to take to address that. Focused on developing antibody tests that could help us identify, people who had COVID, and this has become quite helpful for us in terms of pursuing convalescent plasma production. Ultimately, there's a lot here, I think, not only now, but long term. There are a lot of lessons that will be learned from this, and Dr. Bush and his team, I think, are doing an exceptional job. But again, want to stress, this is not a one organization show. This is something done in collaboration with many, many others. And we're very appreciative of the federal support that we're getting for our efforts in this area. So let's talk about lessons learned. And lessons learned, sometimes we really learn them and sometimes we don't. I hope in this case we really take to heart a lot of these changes because this has been incredibly impactful for us in many significant ways. I think probably the major shift that we've seen is our reliance upon mobiles. That's no longer an area where we can really focus our primary efforts. As an organization, we used to rely on about 60% of our blood supply coming out of mobile operations, and the remaining 40% from fixed sites. We're now essentially reversed in that. We're actually more fixed site dominant, and that's not surprising given shelter-in-place orders, school closures, businesses that also adopting work-from-home policies. Certainly, if somebody used to host a blood drive, if their doors are closed now because they're working from home, they're not going to be able to do the same blood drive. But can we get them to come into the fixed site? So I think the lesson learned here is we had an existing business model in how we did what we did. We learned a tough lesson, and that was that model doesn't work in this environment. We just can't be sustainable. And so it's forced us to change, but this isn't going away, right? How do we deal with this new reality of needing to have that fixed site presence? So certainly our buses too. As I mentioned earlier, we have 130. Well, we had also ordered 30 new ones for this year. And we can't use the majority of these because of social distancing limitations. Now, we're working on strategies to try and overcome that, but the reality is what has worked for so long for us now doesn't work in this new reality. What do we do? How do we deal with that? Key lesson learned is to really anticipate, I think, in a more robust way, the unexpected. I'll talk more about that in a minute. I found a rather disjointed alignment in terms of messaging throughout this crisis as well. You know, there were some times when we had national media calling for more blood donations, and our reality was we had plenty of blood, and we're not wanting to waste it. So it's like, no, that's not the right message. But then when we needed that message, we couldn't get that attention. So and sometimes what the local media was saying was very different from what the national media was saying. So we saw incredible disalignment in terms of messaging, and we need to build those relationships stronger earlier so that they can work more as an ally during times of crisis. We also had some very serious supply chain issues. So trying to gain access to masks, major problem, simply because we hadn't used them before. And so now we need to find out where they're at. Well, lo and behold, the majority of them are being made in China. Well, we don't have a lot of contacts in China. And we were being approached by a lot of what we realized were scammers trying to get us to commit to buy masks. So what do? Well, eventually what we ended up doing was working with a company that was based in China that we had a relationship with. They just didn't do masks. But what we asked them to do was become our broker, if you will, to acquire masks from companies they knew were reputable. And ultimately, we were able to source a significant amount of masks from that approach. But, you know, that again, was a very new experience for us. Maintaining a more robust blood product inventory, you know, one of the challenges I laid out to my production people was they were focused on, okay, I've got 10 days of O-neg. How do I deal with this? And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could use this experience to figure out how do we optimize blood product management given that 8 to 10 day inventory? You know, we're used to the 2 to 3 day. Well, let's push back on that. Let's figure out a way to get to the point where we can be effective at managing a much more robust inventory. I am absolutely convinced our hospitals would very much appreciate our ability to gain mastery over that. So that was another lesson learned out of this. Interestingly, while we were as a volunteer donor sector going through all sorts of changes, so is the plasma industry. In talking with a couple of the plasma executives over the past few months, they have struggled mightily getting their people, their donors, to come in, and they're paid for what they do, but they're not coming in. At some point, they were drawing roughly 50% of the normal run rate. So that's going to represent some interesting challenges I would expect for next year in terms of plasma derivative product availability. But regardless, it really surprised me. I thought, okay, in a challenging economy, the paid donor model should excel, and the reality was it didn't work, not for them. And I'm sure they're investigating that, and I'll leave that to them. They're quite professional, and we'll figure that out. I mentioned the cybersecurity threat issue before, but certainly as we went to a work from home profile, it accentuated certain areas that we had to close quite tightly. We learned very quickly our disaster drills were not the right drills. Those drills did not assume a prolonged experience. They assumed, there was a tornado hit here, or there was an earthquake here. It wasn't that you're in this for 18 months to 2 years. That's a totally different reality. It didn't assume that all of the businesses that usually support us might be shut down. So our disaster drills, frankly, were not well designed for training us in how to deal with the situation. The power of the public leadership voice, though, to me, is one of the major takeaways. When the Surgeon General of the United States got on stage and made a pointed call to action, people responded. The public voice does have a role in sustaining blood donation awareness. And I think that's one of the things we're going to have to capture as we move on. The unpredictability in elective procedure scheduling, in our coordination with the hospitals, we understood their world had turned upside down. Elective procedures canceled, trying to figure out how to staff with the same quarantine challenges we were having. Unpredictable COVID patient flow, an absolute nightmare. And quite honestly, we're trying to find out, okay, what do you need? What do you need? And are we number one in their priority list? Probably not. So figuring out how to really improve those connections and maybe come up with a more predictable information update sharing might be something that we should consider putting into place. We also need to figure out how to manage in that fluid environment, and by fluid I mean demand going up and down and associated staff hours following suit. What do you do if you can't offer enough staff or enough hours for your staff? Well, ultimately we ended up doing some furloughs. We didn't lay anybody off, but we did furloughs. But then we saw demand coming back, so we had to call these staff back. Well, guess what? They couldn't come back in many respects. And so we need to really understand, okay, if we're going to do a furlough, how do we get out of the furlough, kind of the exit strategy from that regard. But we also saw a real drop in morale, overall morale. I mean, the staff were working long hours when we had full production going. They're tired. They're dealing with home issues, just mass protocols, and everything that we were throwing at them really created a degree of stress none of us was anticipating. So helping them work through that and focus on staff retention. We did have some staff depart based upon some of the work schedules, and it's been a major challenge for us coming back to full production. And ultimately, the staff scheduling, the variability in that demand, coupled with the fact that at one point we had over 100 employees quarantined simply because of exposure and contact tracing. So all of those factors really highlighted a need for a cell to be built that could manage all those HR issues in addition to the normal HR duties that the HR department has to fulfill. The family impacts, particularly with schools not being in session, was significant, and right now that's our major challenge. Just as the school years are resuming again, many of them are in a virtual virtual format or some sort of hybrid model. And we're now getting some staff that are saying, I can't work. I can't continue to work for you. In fact, we've had resignations, particularly with some very critical positions from staff that just say, this environment, we can't manage it. So anticipating this kind of a challenge is something that our previous disaster drills just failed us on. We have struggled with this and continue to struggle with how do you take care of families during such a fluid environment. Communications are critical, but packaging those communications absolutely paramount so that people can make sense out of them and we can do follow-up, reinforcing the messages. One thing that really has struck me, perhaps above all else, how important the associations have been and the networks, ABC, AABB, certainly, South Central Association of Blood Banks. All of these organizations in that time of crisis really play a key role in helping us share information, connect, and make better decisions dealing with these challenges. We also have to be appreciative of the FDA. They step up to the plate and they took action on key areas that should help us long term in terms of donor deferrals. But again, our preparation for something that's going to last this long and quite honestly much longer, I would readily acknowledge we were not prepared for the duration here. And certainly our role in overseeing multiple state operations. States are all doing their own thing, and it varies, in keeping some degree of consistency for our staff has been a major challenge. And so we need to evaluate how do we come up with some sort of a standard protocol that is really kind of addressing all the state requirements as well. So environmental shifts, what do we think might stay with us? Well, I think really the new way of drawing blood. I think there are going to be multiple businesses that are going to fail out of this experience. It's just going to be so long-term and devastating, they're not going to survive. And many of them have been loyal blood drive coordinators. And so what do we do without that? We've got to rely on that fixed site location. The fixed sites will be the key moving forward, and I think that's a reality. It's not going to go away. I think social distancing is something people aren't going to forget about. I think once we get a handle on this thing, I think there's going to be a lot of sensitivity to how close people get to one another and how close they are in a vehicle. So if they're used to sitting real close together on the bus, they go through COVID, they're not going to want to go back on the bus. So we have a lot of challenges that we have to recognize are really going to be with us, I think, long term. It could be that the reset of red cell use might really stick. As we saw the downward decline, as electives were deferred, we also, I think, have seen more prudent use, and this is good in terms of patient care and blood use management. We may see a decline long term in terms of blood use. That's a big unknown, but as you go through a prolonged experience of unknowns related to blood product availability, I think in many respects, people get used to dealing with a different reality. And so we may well see that stick with us. Are we going to be wearing masks long term? At this point, I think yes. I don't know that masks are going to go away. I think certainly with the close proximity of a blood donation event, I would not be surprised if the expectation indefinitely is going to be that we're wearing masks. And right now, donors are wearing masks too. That could be the new reality when you're that close to someone you don't know. So we'll have to see on that. Are our staff going to come back into our corporate office? I don't know. We may stay with a work from home profile for quite some time. I believe at this point, at least through the end of this year. Bringing them back, quite honestly, we found many of them were very good at working from home. But there's a challenge with that. We're seeing in some of our staff the work from home is great. It's like, hey, I love this. With others, it's like, I can't deal with this. I need to be connected into the workplace in a more meaningful manner than just a video conference. So we're working through that. But I think for many organizations, the work from home is going to be something that's going to be around for a while. And then there's all the money, the support that's been going out to people in desperate need, the unemployment support, the variety of CARES Act mechanisms, trillions of dollars. What's that going to mean in terms of a changed landscape? When you spend $3 to $5 trillion in a matter of 8-9 months, it's going to have dramatic impacts. And I think from an environmental shift standpoint, it's going to be impactful for what it means in terms of regular health care support, and we'll have to figure out what that really means long term. So let's talk about the disruptive opportunities and threats. As I mentioned earlier, I do believe that the shift toward work from home is going to be quite prolonged, if not permanent, for many organizations. But is there an opportunity there? Can we position ourselves as employers of choice for people, quite honestly, who increasingly are looking for that kind of experience? Can we come up with a way to ensure the work gets done in an effective manner, but have that kind of engagement and connection without them actually being in the workplace? So I think there's an opportunity here to rethink what the workplace really means. And it's one that could be embraced by our staff. I also think it's important from a staff perspective. One of the things that I've clearly seen throughout this crisis, how important transparency is from a staff perspective. Staff are looking for information, and we've been very mindful to try and share that, ultimately because we understand trust is key right now. Our staff need to trust what we say. And it's particularly difficult when we were changing our mask guidance on a regular basis. But in the end, the more transparent we are, I think the higher degree of trust. But I think moving forward, trust is going to be absolutely fundamental. And maintaining that with that work from home is going to be a challenge. So we'll have to figure that out as well. I've asked our folks to take a look at technology, and we've been trying to leverage technology for quite some time. We have the typical systems that I think many organizations like us really have. It's, I think, time to change our thinking about this, because as I look at the technology, I think there's an opportunity. Instead of us just looking for ways to latch, or connect technology into what we do, if we can look at technology differently, in other words, think of ourselves more as a technology company that does blood things, and cause that mindset change, I think we'll look at areas of opportunity for us, because as I see other companies innovating on the technology side, they're so far ahead of where we're at. And so I think we have a huge opportunity on the technology front to really watch what other companies are doing, figure out what works for them, and then figure out how we bring that into our organization. But in the end, it requires that shift in thinking to really be technology focused in most everything that we do. I also think there's going to be a lot of corporate real estate available. We're already seeing that. In fact, we had plans to move to a new headquarters location not long after COVID hit. Those really unraveled. We were approached by the developer saying, can't move forward with the project. And frankly, that makes all the sense in the world. What we are seeing, though, is all sorts of real estate available. So I think there are going to be lots of opportunities for us to find, for the places that we do need, there's going to be real estate opportunities for us that will be lower cost than they have been before. Now, it's going to vary by country, but certainly in many of our markets, we're seeing that already. I'm concerned about cash cycles. The payable cycle from the hospital perspective. I know they're wrestling with many challenges too. So our commitment has to be to work together to figure out some way to ensure we communicate, because just pushing for faster payment really isn't going to do anyone any good. In the end, we're in this together, and we have to figure out a pathway to take care of one another throughout the process. But we do anticipate delays in receivables. What's going to happen with the allocation of federal money? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I think we're going to have to figure it out as we go. But there might be some opportunities to do reset in terms of some funding support that we might get from the government. Certainly, we've seen that with CCP. So there are probably some different opportunities that will come out of this experience related to funding support. And then how long is this going to be around? Nobody really knows, but certainly there are going to be opportunities for us to evaluate as we see this progress, staying close to the information as it's coming out, understanding, where are the opportunities for us as different organizations to take advantage of these. The plasma center draw challenges, as I mentioned earlier, I think are going to produce IG shortages. And we have to be mindful of that, but I think it also may question, particularly on the patient advocate side. So the U.S. supplies 75% of the globe's plasma needs, and we're going to be short on IG. I think it's going to raise some interesting questions sometime next year, assuming there is a shortage on IG, and we'll have to see how that unfolds. I'm concerned about some of the smaller hospitals and their viability during these times, and consolidation is something I don't like to see in anybody. Frankly, I know we've done a lot of consolidation, but frankly, I'd like to see individual organizations survive and thrive in their own right, because I think communities are well served by that. But we'll have to evaluate that. The advisory committee for blood and tissue sustainability and availability is very active, looking at COVID experience, and there is a congressional report being written. I understand we can't gain access to what that says yet, but certainly once it goes to Congress, I think we'll be hearing more about that. And it might represent some opportunities for us coming out of this COVID crisis. I also wonder, I've heard, listening national media, a lot of discussion about, we need more of a national voice. I don't know what that's really going to mean for blood banking long term. Certainly, as we dealt with multiple state differences, it's been a bit of a challenge. But quite honestly, I think there's a lot of value to the differences. So this is going to be a question that is going to be wrestled with by policy leaders on a national level. Where it's going to come, I'm not sure, but I think we need to pay close attention to this. Is there going to be some movement towards centralized decision-making of some sort? I think we in our field need to be very much close in touch with the policymakers so that we understand where this is headed and any shifts that might take place so that we can understand how that might impact us moving forward. So I want to leave you with some parting thoughts. First of all, I very much appreciate you staying with me as I've talked about this experience. I want to reinforce, I believe our organizations, our associations, our trade associations, our cooperatives, they have been so incredibly valuable during this time. They have really demonstrated significant capability, and they're shining right now. And I think it behooves us all to continue to support all of them because they really have been a great aid during a very difficult time. I think the CCP story has been really interesting to watch unfold. And quite honestly, it's been nice during this time of crisis to be able to be involved in something that is so impactful for patients, particularly during a time when so many people are scared of what is yet to come. So I look forward to watching how the CCP story unfolds. I think there's a lot more to come, obviously, in our understanding of it, but certainly it's been something that I very much appreciate being part of. This could have been far worse. If this was transmissible through blood transfusion, it would be even far more catastrophic. It could have been a far more deadly virus. I mean, it just strikes at home how important it is for us to take this notion of planning for disasters quite seriously, because I think this kind of experience, unfortunately, is going to come back again. And as I mentioned earlier, this one isn't over yet. I also want to point out that I have been absolutely amazed at the professionals that work in our field every day. Their commitment, their passion for the mission, absolutely unbelievable. And certainly very appreciative of everything everyone's done, the sacrifices, and ultimately it's all about patients like Grace. You know, we all do what we do to take care of patients, and we do it in partnership with donors. We do it in partnership with one another. Blood centers, hospitals, transfusion services working together. It's all about folks like Grace, and that's why we're here, and that's why we do what we do. And ultimately, during times of crisis, that's why I think we come together and we tend to shine. So it's been a difficult time, but the reality is, I think this field has never done more for so many in my entire 30 years. And I want to thank you all again. I wish you well, stay safe, and take care. Thanks.
That was really good, Dave. Really enjoyed that. Yeah, for those of us that work at other blood centers, we're feeling the same pain, dealing with the same challenges. Of course, I have to say, I don't think any of our couriers got stopped at roadblocks. I thought that was an interesting problem that you guys ran into. I have a couple of questions from the viewers. This first question comes from Dr. Barbara Bryant. What technologies do you think will improve our industry? Also, with real estate, let's start with that first question. So what technologies do you think will improve our industry?
But I think, first of all, having a consistent data set that we exchange on a regular basis for better access to real-time information in terms of blood usage, blood inventory, the availability, and what the trends are will dramatically improve our ability to deal not only with a crisis situation, but just regular ongoing engagement. So that's certainly one area. I think the second, though, is we need far more elegant solutions that provide for direct donor engagement. Our experience, and I think probably most blood center experiences, are the traditional model of the blood drive coordinator is really going to struggle in the new environment. So we simply have to have far more elegant, seamless, direct solutions that allow us to engage directly with donors, develop that relationship, and then sustain that over time. And that includes being able to communicate between our operations. So, for example, if someone leaves an area where I've got a presence and moves to Nancy's area, she should be able to get that donor's information from me so that she can sustain that follow-up. So I think there's a lot that we need to have in the way of exchange of information, but it's through far more elegant solutions. Frankly, I think some of our systems are rather clunky. And as long as they're clunky, they're not going to be embraced by our donors.
Okay. Second question from Dr. Bryant. With real estate availability increasing, how much growth are you projecting for an increase in the number of fixed sites?
Well, that's a good question. We're not sure just yet. We are starting to look at certain parts of our operation where, frankly, we don't have a strong fixed site presence. It's kind of a mixed bag, but we do believe there will be a lot of retail space available in certain areas, and our target is to sustain this 60-40 shift that we've achieved in terms of fixed site versus mobile, and then to push that even further. Quite honestly, I would love to get to an 80-20, where it was predominantly a fixed site operation. You know, I take a look at places like Australia and the UK. They're all predominantly fixed site in their operations. If we can get to that, I think we'll have a better lifestyle for our employees. It'll be easier to engage donors, and with the real estate coming available, I think we'll have opportunities to source sites and move to that as more of a permanent model.
That's the only questions we have from the field. One question I have for you, are some of your fixed sites, do you have all your fixed sites open right now? Or
they're not open. Well, they're operating, yes. You know, we adjust the hours based upon what donor traffic is. We have 126 fixed site locations, and you know they're scattered across the country. So we vary the time according to the availability. But yes, they are all open.
Okay. Okay, that's all the questions I've received for Dave. Dave, thank you again very much. That was a really good presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Well, I very much appreciate the opportunity, and I thank you much.
Okay. Our next speaker is Nancy Eckert. Nancy received a degree from the University of Florida in medical technology. She worked at several hospital transfusion services before going to work at the Blood Center. In 1994, she became the CEO of Life South Community Blood Center in Gainesville, Florida. During that time, the Blood Center has grown into serving hospitals in 3 states. So again, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nancy Eckert.
Hello, my name is Nancy Eckert, and I am the President and CEO of Life South Community Blood Centers. Life South services over 100 hospitals in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. I started out technical as a medical technologist, but I've been in the position of CEO since the early 90s. And during that time, the Blood Center has grown more than tenfold. I'm telling you this because I'm going to give you a few ideas that have helped me lead the organization through this growth. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on our current crisis of COVID. I'll give you a clue. It involves teamwork and practice. In many ways, blood banking is just a logistics business. We have entrusted to us the privilege of getting a life-saving medicine from a volunteer blood donor to a patient in need. As an industry, we have become so good that the recognition of the significance of what we and the blood donors provide each day is somewhat overlooked. However, our routine work is far from routine. We are asked to provide multiple variations of our components depending on the patient and their particular circumstances. In many ways, blood banks have been providing personalized medicine for many years. When ordering at a restaurant, you have to ask if it's acceptable to make a substitution, and many times it is not. We are asked to make variations every day. There are routine surgery setup orders, but we also have massive transfusion protocols for traumas. There are special requirements for newborns, such as O-negative, fresh, and PD splits. There are extended special antigen negative searches to find units compatible for our frequently transfused patients, such as our sickle cell patients. There's the occasional need for reconstituted whole blood, and there are many variations in our platelet requirements. That's just to name a few. You need to multiply that by 8, each of our blood types. And now we have convalescent COVID plasma. For a blood center to try and make everything fit into a routine, we would leave a lot of patients lacking. To provide those life-saving products to a patient when they need it requires a lot of routine teamwork between the blood center, within the blood center, and with the hospital. Daily and sometimes hourly communications and adjustments with and between both organizations is crucial. Determine what is needed by the hospital for their patients and finding a way to provide that product to them in a timely manner is our routine. However, blood centers are very controlled and have to operate within established policies and procedures. We provide a licensed product that lies within a prescribed standard. When an error is brought to me, I usually have 3 questions I ask in the order of importance. Number 1, did we hurt anyone? We have to always be very aware that we have the ability to do harm. Number 2, do we have to notify the FDA? We are strictly regulated by the FDA. And are there any legal ramifications? We all know we can do everything right and still have legal ramifications. Therefore, blood banks must operate within strict guidelines. However, sometimes these rules and guidelines get in the way of a better outcome for the patient. Acceptable exceptions to a rule may be forbidden because those exceptions may just be too difficult to manage. Let's take, for example, our computer systems. Both the blood center and the hospital have one. They direct their business practices. They provide controls. They provide communication. And they provide documentation. To provide a better component may require reworking the computer program, which isn't always very easy. How many labs have manual workarounds because it's just too difficult to go through the computer? Sometimes these workarounds become so ingrained that now they become routine. The FDA is caught in the same controlled environment. However, few of the inspectors have first-hand knowledge and experience in a blood center or in a transfusion service. They will operate strictly by the rules, and we must live by their interpretations and by their decisions. However, this type of business must be seriously managed because failure to do so can have severe consequences. Every day, we are surrounded by authorizations, validations, legislations, litigations, confirmations. So how do we provide that component needed by that patient? The way we do it is we make change routine. We've all heard about change control. Most of the time, change control is considered the unusual. However, here we have made change routine and developed the controls to make it routine. Now, I'll have to admit, not everybody is comfortable with constant change. But you will find those who embrace it, and you will find those who thrive in it. For this to be effective, it requires both leadership and management. They are not the same thing, but they are complementary, and they are both necessary during change or during a crisis. Let's start with management. Management of people, resources, and activities is required to ensure consistent results. You must have consistent and effective training. You have constant decisions being made by management. Rules must be followed. Enforcement is essential. The work is planned, organized, and controlled by management. It is task-oriented with efficient, controlled achievement of goals, KPIs being paramount. When you're hiring individuals who are comfortable with this well-planned control work, sometimes these people are uncomfortable with the change. It is really easy for the leadership of a blood center to evolve into a bureaucratic organization. Working in a highly controlled environment is where bureaucratic leadership would be the most comfortable. Phrases common in bureaucratic leaders is QA or legal won't let us do that, instead of knowing the reason why QA or legal will not let you do that. Another one is, I was only doing my job, or worse yet, and that's not my job. If an organization becomes bureaucratic, it probably has lost its true leadership. And leadership is what is needed to stimulate change or to lead you through a crisis. Of course, there will be time when leadership and management will be at odds. However, leadership is not something that just happens. This is especially true in a team. Leadership is active, ongoing, and constantly changing. Leadership is the ability to translate a vision into action and finally reality. Leadership inspires others to move out of their comfort zone and to take action. You can try to push people, but that usually is not effective. Give them the reason to leave. Give them a reason to move forward. That's the better method. A leader will instill the why, the how, and most importantly, the can-do. Like management, leadership must be established well before a crisis happens. Usually during a crisis, time is of the essence. This can be done through the routine change I talked about earlier. Solving problems and handling situations becomes routine and builds communication. When a crisis happens, the team has to automatically accept your guidance and feel comfortable asking questions. They have to trust your decisions and your directions. There may not be a clear roadmap or information on how to get there. Sometimes you are just dealing with possibilities and not assurances. You will develop confidences in their abilities and have faith in their decisions. They will have confidence that together you will find a way through. After all, you've done it before. History, experience, and integrity are essential during an uncertain period. Trust will be there if you have demonstrated success in the past. Every endeavor you have had has successes. Sometimes it's just getting information, and that information maybe that's not a good way to do it. So let me ask you a few questions. Can your team trust you? How do you handle and manage failure? Failure of yourself or another team member? Do you assume responsibility, or are you always trying to find blame? Is your team afraid not to be successful? Is your team comfortable with change? Have they had the opportunity to meet the unexpected and deal with solving problems? Have they had the experience of the thrill of success? Can you make handling change a habit for your team? Your team's ability to handle problems and unfamiliar situations together needs to be trained. Not only will they build their own competence, they will understand the abilities of the other team members. The good news is that there are many opportunities to practice this. Your mission is to go find them and use them. For years, I have prepared the disaster plan fully equipped with processes and procedures. The problem is most crises don't follow the plan. The most important and valuable part of handling a crisis is a well-informed, experienced, responsible leader. The process of working with the entire team to develop the disaster plan and the manual is more valuable than the manual itself. We have faced many crises in blood banking in the past. My first one that I encountered was HIV. And as we know, HIV has changed blood banking, healthcare, and the world forever. We have dealt with the threat of pandemics such as MERS and Ebola. We have developed tests to deal with West Nile and with Zika. But we have not dealt with anything like COVID. COVID is special. COVID has presented many public issues the entire community must deal with. Therefore, it has impacted our employees, it has impacted the hospitals, and it has impacted our donors. Most of our blood drives revolve around gatherings of people. Therefore, it has affected our ability to collect blood, including how many donors can be on the bloodmobile. Airlines have been greatly affected. Therefore, the ability for us to get our tubes to the lab for disease testing and just moving units from one blood center to another has been greatly hampered. This is just to name some of the few effects that COVID has had on our day-to-day life, not even mentioning masks. However, we who work in blood banking have been given a great opportunity to help. Our mission and our infrastructure are in place to provide relief to many COVID sufferers. All the years of making special modifications for individual patient need is now our greatest asset. Convalescent plasma has quickly become an accepted method of treating the severely and the not so severely ill COVID patients. On April 1st, it was officially announced to community blood centers by Dr. Peter Marks from the FDA that convalescent plasma is a very valuable and necessary part of fighting COVID-19. This was during a conference call and probably had not even thought about it before that. I hadn't in the blood center. The need was so urgent that the FDA created an emergency processes where the blood centers could collect and provide the hospitals antibody-containing plasma. The FDA was taking unprecedented moves to make this happen. They repealed a few of the restrictions they had on blood donors so that recovered COVID patients could donate plasma. Some of these were restrictions that the blood centers have been asking for years for the FDA to consider repealing. However, one was changing the deferral after a blood transfusion from 1 year to 3 months, so that those patients who had been in the hospital and had received plasma 3 months later could donate. A statement made by Dr. Marks during that conference call was, "We are flying this plane while we build it." This is very unusual for the FDA. I think most of us think of the FDA, we think of control. And he is right. We still do not have the answers to questions usually provided before a product is released for general use and claims are made. And that includes evidence that it actually works. Because plasma is a licensed product with all the safety already built in, the FDA was willing to give it a go. At this point, the worst that could happen is it doesn't work. The safety is already ensured. It was initiated under an IND run by Mayo, and that IND actually involved the hospitals more than it did the blood centers. So that was April 1st. I was part of that conversation. Well, I listened to it anyway. On April 2nd, I got a call from Ortho Diagnostics and asked if we would be interested in doing COVID antibody testing. I said I would, and on April 3rd, we were notified we would have an instrument shipped to us. It was shipped out April 6th, arrived April 9th. Our techs were trained April 14th and 15th, and we started testing April 16th. For anyone who has brought up an instrument, and not only an instrument, but a new test, that was very, very quickly. So we did not have the instrument, and we definitely didn't have the information surrounding most tests when they are released. Because it was so new, there were not known positive samples. And so our validation on that instrument was very limited. So we went around and collected tubes from people within the building so that our techs could have experience on the instrument. What we found, out of the 20 employees that we tested, 1 was positive for COVID antibody. She had felt like she had the symptoms, but a lot of people do, that she had had COVID, and she felt very strongly she knew where she had contracted it. She contacted several people who were at the same party, and they came in, and 90% of those people had antibody. She became our first convalescent plasma donor, and we had a couple other donors come within the next day or two. And it was so needed at the time that some of those units were taken before the infectious disease testing was complete. We have sent out requests to our hospitals, our donors, and the general public to help identify previously diagnosed patients who have recovered from COVID and now are willing to donate. During the first 2 weeks, we had over 100 post-COVID-19 patients sign up. Some were not acceptable as blood donors, but most that made appointments had successful donations. Interesting point here is we had donors come in who had been patients and who diagnosed as having COVID, and when we tested them for antibody, they were antibody negative. I'm not sure what the significance of that is, and I don't think anybody is at this point, but it is interesting facts, and again, we are building this plane trying to understand this disease and trying to understand the significance of the testing as we do it. Of course, providing the Bs and the ABs early on became an issue and continues to be an issue. Our demand for convalescent plasma began to go up at that point. By the end of April, we were providing about 50 units a week. At the end of May, about 110 units per week. The end of June, 200 per week. And the end of July, nearly 400 per week. In the span of 4 months, we were able to go from 0 units to 400 to 500 units per week. How is that possible in such a short period of time? The reason it was possible is because the team was in place. For years, the Blood Center and the team have honed its skills needed to provide special components for patients with particular needs. We already had a process in place for providing special antigen units, identifying them, and sending them for our sickle cell patients. So with COVID, the lab identifies the donor, the collection staff collects appropriately, and the hospital services staff gets it to where it needs to be. In May, we started testing all our donors for COVID-19 antibodies. In most cases, before the unit is available for labeling from infectious disease, the lab has already identified the COVID antibody positive units and has placed a hold on that unit. We have been able to use that unit, and the donor now becomes available for another collection. It is passed to our recruitment team, who tries to re-recruit that donor as a plasma donor. When we started in May, our reactivity rate was about 1.6%. It held well below 2% until July. Since then, the rate has gone every week, has gone up. From 2.1% the week of the 4th of July to 6.4 last week, in just a span of 6 weeks. The ability of donors with antibody that can donate for convalescent plasma is going up. We're able to find more and more, but so is the need. Weekly meetings that here in the Blood Center, both with national organizations such as BCA, AABB, ABC, happen routinely. Locally, among ourselves and with the hospital, communications happen daily. And it is part now of routine operations reports within the Blood Center. Every person in the Blood Center has played a role in providing convalescent plasma to these patients. The saga goes on, and unfortunately, the need will continue for some time. However, in light of this life-changing pandemic, I cannot express to you how honored I feel to be part of Life South and what it's doing helping people get through this terrible disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That was really interesting. Interesting to hear your experience with CCP, as many of us have had similar experiences. I'm looking, don't have any questions yet from the attendees. I did have one for you with the latest with the FDA coming out with the EUA for CCP. And you were saying that you were identifying donors and then holding the plasma on those. I'm assuming that was from whole blood donors?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And there was a meeting where the FDA is actually going to discourage manufacturing of CCP from whole blood donors, which I'm not 100% sure of the rationale on that.
I think what was the other night, what they were, Peter Marks was saying is they will want to, the first time you test them positive, they would like a confirmatory test. So it's a second test, a different test to confirm that. And if I understood what he said correctly, once you've confirmed that they're positive, when they come back, that is a second positive test. But if you test it, we are probably premature with that. But you can use the first unit as CCP if you perform a second test on it.
I got you. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. I do have one question.
There's a lot of people who feel very strongly they've had COVID. They just haven't been, especially early on when testing was so difficult, didn't get a test done because early on, as you know, people went 14 days before the test results came back.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to go ahead and be isolated anyway.
Yeah. Well, when the whole CCP thing started, I remember it was you had to have test. You had to test negative by swabs 2 times. If you were 28 days.
Very complicated.
Yeah, then they dropped that, and we've actually seen that happen too. Before we started antibody testing, was that we'd have people who met that criteria, donated, really didn't know what their antibody status was because the testing was so limited at the time, and then afterwards they came back 2 more times and they were negative, And we've even had cases where, like, even on a third donation, then they come up positive. And it's like, so did they get exposed since they started donating CCP, or did it take their immune system that long to actually develop antibodies? But you're talking about a couple of months time period. So it is interesting to look at the data.
We've seen as a rule, it decreases over time, like the literature says. But we've also seen in a few cases where the antibodies did get stronger. But of course, if you're a med tech, you know, tests are different. So, you know, that's been our experience with the couple months that we've been doing this. It is interesting.
Yeah. I do have one question. This is from Roxanne Smith. I'm sorry to put the glasses on here. Did, kind of following up on what Dave talked about earlier, did you also see a shift of collections from mobiles to fixed sites?
We did. We saw a huge increase in the fixed sites because I do believe the donors feel a little bit more comfortable coming into the fixed sites. You're able to do some distancing that you're not able to do on the mobile. But what we did on our mobiles was restrict the number of people that could be on the mobiles. And we have beds, you know, of course, on mobiles on both sides of the mobile. We were only using nations. So you didn't have people directly across from the aisle. And so that restricted the number of donors that could be on the mobile at any given time. So we still send out mobiles, but it's not at the historic areas that we go to, you know, the schools and the organizations, you know. But it's amazing if you park a mobile in front of a Walmart and the retail, which is usually our last ditch effort when we were recruiting donors, is now an area that quite a few donors come to.
Yeah, we've actually seen that too at the, what we call the park and praise.
Right.
So yeah, we've seen that phenomenon too, which is kind of scratching our heads. But hey, as long as they're showing up, we're happy. Okay, folks. Well, it's after 12 o'clock. Again, thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Dave. Thank you for everybody that signed on, and we will continue on with our first online annual meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.